And welcome to a very special bookmark, a remote one with our great friend Father Brian Thomas Becket Milady himself, OP. The book is Captivated by the Master, a theological consideration of Jesus Christ, proudly published by EWTN Publishing. EWTNRC.com is the place you can get this book. It's great to see you, Father Milady, doing multiple series for us, obviously with Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. And you also did many, many series over the years, of which this book is based, right?
Right. This was from, believe it or not, the early 90s. I think it may have been the second series I made on EWTN in the early 90s.
Right, and I've always said that I remember watching those before I ever came here. I thought those were some of the best series that have been done. And if I played a small part, hopefully, in bringing you back to our audience on a regular basis, I think that was a smart move on my part.
I wouldn't say small, I would say big. And
there
I thank you.
So who approached you about taking this book and turning it, the actual series into a book? Did EWTN approach you about that?
Yes, because I know you've been turning a lot of your series into books. So I had the one about the Ten Commandments,
right? But
then they thought that this might be a good one also. So that's why we did it.
Are you surprised in some ways that it seems like the questions in this book, the Christological issues of Jesus and who he was and how we relate to him, seems to be a bigger issue today than it even was 20, 25 years ago when you first did the series?
I don't know if it's a bigger issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think even more people, because we're so uncatechized, have less catechesis on this. Mm-hmm. Actually, this issue, in Catholicism, it tends to date from the 60s. But way back when in the Anglican Church, Dorothy Sayers talked about this in 1930s in England, because they kept trying to reduce Jesus to just a good man, so good as somehow to be identified with God, who preached a simple doctrine of love and pacifism. And she wrote those plays that Father Fezio published on the Gospels, because she said there were people, and Chesterton said this too, people rejecting Christianity who had no idea what we actually taught, especially about Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Right, you mentioned that right in the front of the book. I was going to ask you about Dorothy Sayers, and you talk about the fact that in the early 90s at a seminary where I taught, many of the directors of religious education told the seminarians who'd go out to the parishes not to teach doctrine, but focus on just making the children feel happy to be there.
That's right. The catechesis was Jesus being happy to be with you. I remember I was in Sardinia because I let have my heart there at a parish many years ago when I lived in Rome. And they asked me what catechesis is like in the United States. And I said, well, it's kind of like draw Jesus with a balloon, Jesus eating an ice cream cone, etc. I said, that's weird. That's the way it is here in Italy, too. And we don't like it. And they said, we, for example, our kids are getting confirmed. They don't know the Mass is a sacrifice. We know it's a sacrifice. We don't understand it totally, but we know it's a sacrifice because they don't teach people our religion anymore. Our religion mm-hmm. isn't really presented either in the pulpit or in schools. Right. And if anything, Catholic schools often teach the opposite, which is strange,
Do you think and you've been involved with teaching in seminaries and teaching over the years, it almost seems to be, for all of these great intellects out there teaching it, don't they see they're teaching themselves out of a job? Because ultimately they're making it so that it really doesn't matter whether you go to church or whether you really are a Catholic who lives out their faith.
I agree with you about that. I think they're very interested in social justice. Mm-hmm. They want to change the church into a social justice institution. I also think that I think I put the story in the book too, mm-hmm. that priest, remember, who said that Christ misinterpreted a psalm in a sermon. And when the parishioner questions about it, he said, well, you got to remember, Jesus didn't have the same religious education we have today.
Right.
All the modern scholarship brings us. I mean, the guy who wrote the article said, this guy is not a nut. He's a good person, but whatever he was taught in the seminary, the Catholic seminary, wasn't very good.
But
So
isn't that in some ways, I read that and it struck me that it's kind of indicative of this ahistorical view we have now, this progressive view, that we look back and say, well, those people back there weren't very smart, you know what I mean? So we got to understand they made these kind of mistakes. We don't blame them. They just weren't that intelligent. We know so much more. Like you said, we have such great critical theory and analysis now that our understanding is so much better than theirs.
that's a part of it. And also a part of it is people today believe that truth is culturally based.
Mm-hmm.
So those people lived in a different culture. And what we have to do is translate what they said of the Nicene Creed for their culture to our culture, which means, and that can be done in a good way, but this means that since our culture is very materialistic and we look on the truth in ourselves, after all, we just had a supposedly Catholic newscaster in a large television station saying that we didn't need a higher power to solve our problems. All we needed was what was in us. Since that's the case, I mean, they reinterpret Jesus to be that way. And also, they would maintain that modern people just can't relate to miracles.
Mm-hmm.
So you get rid of all that miracle stuff.
Right. Well, it's interesting, too, because you start off with the thing of Dorothy Sayers and talking about Anglicanism, and you look at that kind of thing, and somebody sits back and says, well, if all of this is such a great idea, this kind of Jesus pal stuff, why aren't the mainstream, mainline, what we used to call, the Lutherans, and the Presbyterians, and the Methodists, and the Episcopalians, you would think they'd be thriving rather than dying.
Exactly. Well, you're exactly right about that. But the motto, I think, of most postmodern culture is nothing succeeds like failure. Mm-hmm. If it didn't work, just keep doing it, and it'll eventually work. And they want to dismantle the traditional faith. Why, I don't know, but they do. And I think maybe because they think it's hard, or they never studied it, or they're not interested, or it seems bizarre. I've always believed, this doesn't really relate to the book, but I, as you know, was primarily a moral theology teacher. And I'm much more interested in doctrine than I am in morals. Mm-hmm. I became a moral theology teacher because I realized from teaching in the 70s that people were changing our doctrine to fit their moral practice. Mm-hmm. So if Christ is never challenging you to anything and the cross isn't a part of anything, why do you have to control yourself regarding sexuality or your anger? Mm-hmm. Why not have rage and burn down the city? If you think it works, it's going to bring forth change. And so the attempt to emphasize that Christ and the cross go together, and that we have our own crosses that we have to take up, and that includes, as the Imitation of Christ used to say, the primary cross is in yourself. Right. It's addressing your egotism. They want Jesus to be just egotistical, sort of like all the rest of us, only just better. That's all.
Well, that's why he understands us so well and appreciates that. Well, I'm kind of doing the best I can, sort of.
Right, sort of.
Yeah, sort of. Now, you say the book attempts to address a gap in the knowledge of modern Christians about the nature and implications of the traditional systematic doctrine of Christ. And you talk about the short summary of the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church on Christ for the training and consolation of the faithful. Was it on purpose that this wasn't transferred, or was it just people who thought they were doing the right thing and were misguided, a little bit of both?
I believe that Catholic theologians, Father Mitch mentioned this a bit, after the war, many of them were highly influenced by what we used to call the philosophy of the absurd. And they believed that just as St. Thomas had related Christ to Aristotle, which was fine for his time, now in the age of absurdity, after all these people were murdered and massacred in World War II, we have to relate Christ to the absurd in our time. And the way they did that was basically trying to de-divinize Jesus. And for some, I was quoting that talk Cardinal Ratzinger gave, the keystone of the whole thing was that many modern theologians don't think there's any difference between God and the world. He called it the metaphysics of creation. Even to say this, a transcendent deity that's the origin of absolute truth, that's absolutely perfect, that calls us beyond ourselves. We don't really have much evidence of that, according to these people. It was reflected very much in a book C.S. Lewis wrote, which was called God in the Dock. And the dock, you know, is a place where the accused stands in an English courtroom. And it was us, as modern man, accusing God and saying, make sense to me. Show me why I should believe in you. Make sense to me. I think the world is absurd. How do you relate to that absurdity? Right. And it's like us challenging and tempting God to adapt his revelation to our particular culture. Now, it's true, Jesus does adapt himself. One of the problems we'll talk about in the book is, you know, we believe in Catholicism that the contemplative way of life in the monastery is the most perfect. But for people in the world, the most perfect way of life, because the Dominicans do this, according to St. Thomas, is what you learn in contemplation to share in action with others. So why didn't Christ live in a monastery? Well, because he had to be here for us. And in order to do that, he had to go out and teach the people, walk the streets, relate to the world, and that sort of thing. So it was to share his doctrine they did that.
Right. Well, you write here that modern attempts to separate Christ from his cross and to suggest that his purpose was merely to resist unjust social structure or to be a wise moral teacher are not only misplaced but false. But that seems to be the preeminent thing you hear, right?
Right. And that's what Cardinal Ratzinger reflected in that talk he gave in 1989. That's almost a verbatim quote from him. And that was Pope Benedict before he became Pope, and it was almost 30 years ago. Now, you can imagine, the interesting thing was the audience were all Catholic theologians in Europe, including bishops, rectors of seminaries, etc. Now, you can imagine if that's been presented to people for the last 30 years, especially the clergy, what they must be teaching the laity. Now, I think the young clergy are very good. They criticize this, but they're still, doesn't mean that they're not taught it in certain ways.
Right, and impacted by it as well. You say if we're to imitate Christ, we have to know and love who he really is, not some modern, comfortable reimaging that's usually reducible to niceness.
Right. Jesus taught us how to be nice, that's all, you know. And why do we come to church? To be nice, to feel good. And remember, one of my classic images is the modern Christ is not Christ on the cross, but you have the cross with a California happy face on it. And we're all supposed to come and just be happy.
Right.
And I don't go to church to be challenged, to be made to feel good. I remember I gave a sermon once on Ash Wednesday. It was in a Newman Center. And the pastor said, yeah, this guy came out of church and said, I don't like that guy. He made me feel guilty. And I said, well, gee, I don't mind. I agree that you shouldn't make people feel guilty all the time, but don't you think Ash Wednesday is the time?
Right.
There's no other day in the year. That's the time, right?
Right.
But no, we only come to feel warm fuzzies.
Right.
That's it.
And we have to thank everybody for taking the 1 hour to come. We're enthused that they showed up. And we need to thank the people who show up over and over again. Well, I always remember your line, and I quote it often, is Christ didn't die on the cross to say, have a nice day. I mean, that's kind of what you are.
Yes.
Exactly. Now, you also say here, the fact is that when we get Christ wrong, the God of man becomes man, and Jesus just shows us how to be more human. Sin and redemption become too negative to have any place in genuine faith, and the church is reduced to a human society and the sacraments to celebrations of ourselves. And then you go on to say, Eucharist becomes an assembly where the community gathers to find unity in itself, Christ as a guru rather than in communion with God, and Christ as God.
Yeah, it's kind of Christ, the community organized. Yeah. Right. The priest is the community organizer. And it's actually the community that conducts the Eucharist, not the priest. And, the priest just represents the assembly. I was in one church in another diocese in the Northwest, and the pastor was very nice. He was new. And he said, now, Father Brian, there's something we do here you're not going to like at Mass, but I haven't had a chance to change it. I said, well, what is it? He says, you don't start Mass from the altar. You have to sit down in the congregation. And you're only allowed to go up there when you give the homily. And then at the end, you have to sit down with the congregation again. You're not allowed to sit in the sanctuary. And so I said, well, that it's this mentality that we just come from the assembly, etc. And I said, well, it's not exactly evil. It's just stupid. I'll do it, but because I understand you're in a hard place. But
Right.
it's unfortunate that we have a man-centered religion totally, and not a God-centered religion. And part of it reflects the fact, is reflected in our picture of Christ, which is, I'm constantly amazed at people's attitude toward Christ.
Mm-hmm. Right, you say here, and I think it kind of relates to what you're describing there, the proponents of this particular view of what you're describing reduce the Gospels to something like a cocktail party conversation.
Yeah. I have often been experienced pastors that will tell me when I'm giving mission sermons, now bring it down, bring it down, bring it down to lady. Don't talk lofty terms. And I'll say, we believe that Christianity is the revelation in Christ of what goes on eternally in the Trinity. There's only so far you can bring it down, and it ceases to be Christianity. Mm-hmm. And we do need to talk about Christ's humanity because he's our model for our humanity, and his Sacred Heart, and his passions, and his knowledge, and his will, and all those things. But it has to always be oriented to the fact that he wants to open the eternal to us. And unfortunately, I think in a lot of places, the eternal is quite eclipsed, even in Catholicism.
Right. Well, you also make the point in the chapter, Jesus Makes Sense, you say, and so the incarnation can be defined as the assumption of human nature and ordered composition of body and soul by the divine person without confusing them with his divine nature. All errors, and we shall see many in the next chapter, which has to do with heresies, we'll talk about that, can be reduced to the negation of these two natures or the unity of the person of Christ.
Right. So you either have the two classic heresies are the fact that, besides saying Jesus isn't a divine person, that's another issue, but that there's only one nature in Jesus. The Greek word for that is monophysite, because physics means nature and mono means one. So monophysite is either someone says it's only God, only man, or a confused mixture of the two. The other big heresy is that there are two persons in Christ, a divine person and a human person, which is the Nestorian heresy. Mm-hmm. And I've heard all kinds of preachers refer to the human person of Jesus. And when you say there is no human person in Jesus, they take you to be denying his humanity. Mm-hmm. And say, no. He is, it's true. The divine person has two natures. One is very human, in which he asks, but the actually I of Christ, I, and not these I, physical I, but the I as a pronoun, mm-hmm. that is the second person of the Trinity, who now shows himself in another way in addition to his divinity. And the classic way that's put is what he was not, he assumed; what he was, he remained. And the only reason he assumes this is to suffer and die on the cross for us by loving obedience to reverse Adam's unloving disobedience. Mm-hmm. That's another thing. Everybody wants to love Jesus, but nobody wants to obey him. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was some line about, if you keep my commandments, I think somewhere in the scriptures our Lord said, didn't he?
Lots of them, yeah. Another big line is Jesus wasn't a priest because he didn't go through an ordination ritual. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, his first grace is his human nature. Nobody else is like this, is directly joined to the person of the Word. Mm-hmm. That makes his human nature holy. That's why he's called anointed, Christos, Messiah. He doesn't need an ordination ritual for that to happen. But there's all kinds of crazy stuff. I remember I was sitting with a priest once. He was a good priest at the table about 25 years ago at a parish in the Northeast. And he said, I never could call myself as a priest another Christ. Because remember, that's what we used to call priests, Albert Christus, till I realized that Jesus was a sinner just like all the rest of us. And I preached this in my pulpit, and I thought, oh dear. Mm-hmm. Now, I didn't start a fight about this. Right. At the table, it was at the place. However, I was amused at this because his parish was an Italian national parish in a place like Philadelphia. And I was trying to imagine all those old Italian ladies
That
dressed
is
in
right.
black. When the priest gets up and tells them Jesus was a sinner,
Right.
it's like, my son is, how dare he say my son is a sinner? Who does he think he is? You know,
Right.
fortunately,
Right. The rosary beads in horror with what he's saying.
that's right.
Right. Absolutely.
That's right. He eventually changed his mind. But he was abided with the whole thing that Jesus was a sinner too. I mean, how on earth can anybody think that Jesus could save us from sin? Well, the whole reason he came here was to save us from sin. And he can't be a sinner. He doesn't die on the cross for himself. It's all for us. Everything he does is for us. And how can he give us the vision of God in heaven if he doesn't have it himself as a permanent possession?
Well, I'm wondering today with what you see and you deal with today, in the sense of, a lot of people don't seem to either think there is anything called sin, there isn't any sin, or whatever it is, it doesn't really matter because God is all merciful and hence understanding.
Yes, that's exactly true, except for one thing: smoking. Smoking is the only sin left, and it isn't really even a sin done in moderation. But you can anything else you want, but that's a societal sin of the 20th century, which is very, very weird, in my opinion. But it's.
You also make the point here, I think, about heresies, and I wanted to ask you this. You talk about how every heretic affirms something true about Christ, but does so in a disproportionate or exaggerated way, such as denying something else true about him. And the question I would have is what would you say of the heresies you kind of run through here? Do you think, is there one that you run into the most that's still popular? Is it Gnosticism? Is it Arianism? What is it you run into in your mind?
Well, Arianism is a form of monophysitism, and it's really monophysitism. Anything that there's only one nature in Christ. For Arius, Jesus was a creature still. He wasn't God. He was the most perfect creature, but wasn't God as such. And that's the most prevalent heresy. And of course, today we have my truth. This is my Jesus, and I make up who I want Jesus to be. Well, that's because modern people, the last 300 years, following certain brands of European philosophy, think there is no objective truth. We can see that big time in both our government and our society. In some ways, our church today. You know, there is no objective truth. We create the truth from our needs. So if that's your truth, that's your truth. This is my Jesus. My Jesus is the place. And so you want to say, but is he the real Jesus? Because if he's not, created something in your mind that you say you're loving, that isn't the real Christ. So you have to have your ideas objectively formed. Another big deal today in catechesis is people will say, well, don't teach people propositions, articles of the creed. It's only a personal relationship thing. Well, it's both. Because if you have the wrong idea of who the person is you're loving, you're not loving a real person. You're loving a figment of your own imagination. It's false love. So the propositions are necessary to be sure that we know that we're loving the authentic Christ. It's true. It's not just something you pass a test in. It has to convert your soul to a relationship. But you have to be sure you're relating to the right person. That's the thing.
Yeah, otherwise, in a sense, you've got an angel of light coming to you and, in a sense, teaching another gospel that you're listening to.
Exactly. Which St. Paul said was going to happen. So.
What about Manichaeanism? We hear about that sometimes. What is that about?
Manichaeanism is a heresy St. Augustine dealt with greatly. In fact, he believed in it when he was a young man. And it's the idea that spirit is good and flesh is evil. And so the only way, Albigensitism, which was the heresy that the Dominicans were found to combat, is a form of Manichaeanism. It comes from the East, Near East. And so what do you do with someone who says the Word of God took flesh, if flesh is evil? I mean, they must have even seemed to take flesh. And some people thought Christ didn't really die on the cross. It was someone else, or it was a ghostly body. It was a ghost. It wasn't real. Christ, remember, in the resurrection demonstrates his body's real because he invites them to put, not a ghost. Right. But there was a whole strain of Christianity influenced by Manichaeanism.
So let me ask you, in the last minute we've got here, you've got a new series with the deacon coming up, right? On EWTN,
Yeah,
I believe, right?
yeah, that's on the Ten Commandments too. So,
Okay. So we can look for that. And what about another book? You working on anything else right now?
well, I'm editing a book on grace, but not for you.
Okay.
It depends on what Devlin and you and you guys want. But there are a couple of other series I could make. But yeah, my great opus, which is very, very deep and very, very academic. Yes, it's not for popular consumption, believe me. I'm going to probably publish it on, offset, books
Right.
on demand,
Right.
because it's an academic book, big time.
Right.
But no, I'd like to write a popular book on nature and grace too, and I did make a series on that too.
Right.
So,
I remember. So we can.
yeah, I believe they have a transcript of that too.
Okay.
So.
Sounds good.
But
Listen, just because we don't publish it doesn't mean we won't feature it on the network or on this show. And I know you can bring it down for us to understand your opus as well, maybe, when you get a chance.
Okay. Thank you, Doug.
All right, my friend. It's always great to see you. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Father Brian Thomas Becket Milady, the one and only, Captivated by the Master, a theological consideration of Jesus Christ, published by EWTN, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Always highly readable, always highly informative. Thank you so much, Father Milady. We'll see you next time here on Bookmark.